Hello everyone, my name is Zorak Azdur, and in this video I'd like to talk about emotions, emotional coping, more specifically negative emotions, and how all of that relates to addiction. Now, a lot of these ideas that I'm going to express in this video have come from another YouTuber, and his name is Dr. K. His channel is Healthy Gamer GG. He's a psychiatrist that went to Harvard, and he's talked about a lot of these concepts, but this is my view of these concepts and my personal experience with them. All right. Now, first, let me just lift up this camera. Okay, first, let's talk about emotions, right? What is an emotion? I think an emotion is analogous to, or I hope I pronounced that right, to a script of code. So for example, when you write code for a computer, once you've written your code, you can run that code and it will execute the exact same tasks. Like, by running that code, the computer will execute the exact same tasks as long as you keep running that code. You don't need to rewrite the code or anything. So once you have certain code, you can always use it to execute a certain set of tasks. I feel like that is very similar to what an emotion is. An emotion is a very fast, efficient way for humans to react in a certain way to a certain event. Like little code scripts inside your mind, like code scripts for your brain. Things that the brain can quickly just choose between these code scripts. It doesn't need to come up with a whole methodology about how to react to a certain event. It can just choose between these code scripts. The code scripts being emotions. So for example, we have fear, we have anger, we have happiness, we have sadness. So let's say you're out walking in the woods and you see a bear, right? Your brain doesn't need to really identify the bear, think about what we should do. Is this bear a threat? I mean, I'm sure it does all of that. And it does that very fast and very efficiently. But I also think it simply identifies, yes, there's a high chance that this can be, this animal is a threat, and therefore we should run this script. And the script being, oftentimes if you see a bear in the woods, it's going to be fear, right? Another example is, let's say someone shoves you and they start talking shit about you. You identify that as a threat, but instead your brain decides to run a different script, a different response, which is anger. And actually, now that I'm discussing this, I think it's very interesting that there's only a few specific scripts, a few emotions. Like, I mean, there's quite a few emotions, but considering all the possible things you can do in a world where anything is possible, like, you can do fucking anything. Like, you can just, like, strip, like, let's say someone starts bullying you, you can strip naked and twerk if you wanted to. So it's interesting that there's a few scripts that humans tend to follow that are quick, efficient ways to react to events. And this is very important evolutionarily, I think, because if you do see that bear in the woods, you don't want to be, like, thinking about it. You don't want to be, like, weighing the pros and cons. Should I run? Is this a threat? Maybe this is a friendly bear. No. You want to activate a strong impulse to run. That would create the highest rate of survival. And you want these to be very fast and very efficient impulses. And I think that those are what emotions are. I'm going to move because, oh, fuck. See, I'm feeling emotion right now. And that is, I'm afraid that my parents are somehow going to hear what I'm discussing and they're not going to like it. And that is making me anxious. And I think anxiety is an emotion. But I will press onwards. Now. Okay, so I said emotions, and then, you know what, I'm going to stop this video right here, actually. I think this is a good point to stop. I've thought about it, and I think making short, small videos about different topics is better than stringing them together over one topic. But I do also want to keep talking. So, alright, that's all I have to say about emotions. If that's all you wanted to hear, then close this video right now. But next I'm going to discuss emotional coping. So then what is coping? I think coping is a way to react to an emotion. And I think there can be healthy ways to react to emotions. There can be unhealthy ways to react to emotions. And those are all forms of coping. And a simple example is you see that bear in the woods and you start running. I think that's coping. Coping is a action you take to be able to tolerate or reduce the feelings that an emotion gives you. I think coping is basically how you react to an emotion. And I think you have some degree of choice, but I also think it's impossible to fully suppress emotions and fully ignore them, at least in my personal experience. And I think generally speaking that makes sense, right? Why would they exist if you can just ignore them? Like, for example, if you encounter a bear in the woods, you can't, even if you, I guess if you're suicidal, but if you encounter a bear in the woods, you can't, like, not be afraid. You'll feel fear. Maybe if you're suicidal, I guess you won't, but you'll still feel afraid. Like, even if you're suicidal, I think that, like, if I were to jump scare you, right? If I were to, you walk into your house and all of a sudden, like, and I jump at you as you enter the door, I think you'll still, like, lurch backwards, and I think you'll feel like you'll experience fear. So I think in a lot of cases, you can't not experience your emotions, but I think you have some degree of choice in how you react to them. And I think the way you react to them, that's how I view coping, right? So there's unhealthy ways to cope, there's healthy ways to cope. And so one way of coping is running or exercise. And I think exercise makes sense as a way of coping. Like, if you think about it, if you were to see that bear in the woods and you were afraid, you would run away, and that feeling of fear would reduce as you got further and further away from the bear, right? And so basically you're coping with that feeling by running away. And like nowadays, if you're afraid that you're going to fail your classes, right? Obviously, nowadays, there can be a lot of things that trigger emotional responses, but that aren't actually life or death situations. For example, if you're about to get a failing grade, chances are you're not going to die even if you do fail. Like, I don't know, maybe your parents are, like, really sadistic and, like, mentally insane, but generally speaking, parents care about you, and generally speaking, even if they have very high expectations, like, even if they may have high expectations, if you fail that class, you'll still survive, you'll still get through it. But the emotion is very similar, right? Like, the fear you feel about failing a class and the fear you feel when you encounter a bear in the woods is not that different, I don't think. Maybe it is. Maybe there are varying degrees of intensity for emotions. So the fear you feel when you see a bear in the woods and the fear you feel when you're about to fail a class, maybe failing class is less intense fear, perhaps. But either way, there's ways you can cope with it. You can, like, for example, when you're feeling afraid, I think generally speaking, what a lot of people will do is, there's many ways you can cope with it. And so, this was my last point. Okay, so I'm getting on to the last thing I talked about at the start of the video, which is addiction and how all of this relates to addiction. So, addiction is a way of coping, I think, in a lot of cases. It's true that you can also just be addicted to something, but I think negative emotions and negative experiences in your lives can feed your addictions if you don't know how to handle those emotions, because your addiction can be a coping mechanism, right? Fuck, I'm scared. I'm scared about talking about this. Like, my parents are right. My mom is, like, nearby, and for some reason, I don't like talking about this with the possibility of her hearing about that. And maybe that is something I should investigate, but I'm not going to burden you in this video with that. I'm going to press on. So, like I was saying, yes, addictions can be coping mechanisms. For example, people say, like, you drink all the pain away. That's a common expression, right? That's because you experience pain. You don't know how to handle this pain. You don't know a healthy way to handle this pain, and so you start drinking, and that might feed your alcoholism. That might lead you to become an alcoholic. And I think it becomes a synergistic effect, especially with drugs, because I'm pretty sure drugs, even if there are no emotions, once you're addicted to a drug, like, your body develops a need for that drug. I'm not very well versed on that topic. I don't have much to say about that. But my point is that negative emotions, when not handled properly, can feed addictions or can feed unhealthy behaviors. And examples of this could be cutting yourself when you feel like shit. It can be taking drugs when you feel like shit. It can be binging a TV show when you feel like shit. It can be eating a bunch of junk food when you feel like shit. All of these things are just coping with emotions. But there's also, on the flip side, healthy ways to cope with those emotions. Examples of that could be exercise, running, right? You get exercise and you feel better, generally speaking, if you're feeling very emotional. Another thing you can do that I think can be one of the most effective ways to deal with emotions is sit there with your emotions. Instead of running away from them, instead of even coping at all, just sit there, experience your emotion, be aware of it, and that will allow your emotions to push you towards forward progress, right? Because what is the point of an emotion? Let's say you're feeling very lonely. You have two options, right? You can either drink a bunch of alcohol and feel numb, or you can sit there with that loneliness. You can just sit there. Don't run away with it. Sit there. And at some point, you'll feel so lonely, and the more and more you wait, the more and more likely it is that your loneliness overcomes your fear of talking to people or whatever it is that's holding you back from socializing. That loneliness pushes you to socialize and make forward progress in your life. The same thing can happen when you feel like shit about yourself. Like, let's say you're about to fail a class. Yeah, you can cope and you can go just watch TV and give up, or you can sit there with that emotion, and that might push you, well, even though I might fail, I might as well give it my best shot, learn as much as I can so I can do better next time. And that emotion can be used as fuel in the future. Yeah, so you have three options when faced with negative emotions from my view. You can cope, and you can cope in healthy ways. You can cope in unhealthy ways. You can just sit with the emotion. I guess that's two options. Healthy, unhealthy, sitting. Coping healthily, coping unhealthily, and sitting with the emotion. Those are your three options. And I think, generally speaking, although it's hard and sometimes maybe impossible, I think the best solution is to sit there with the emotions, because emotions all have a purpose. You evolved to have emotions for a reason. They're meant to push you forwards in your life. They're a signal to create change in your life and to push you to create change. Another example of a very powerful emotion is boredom. Let's say you can't bring yourself to study. Lock yourself in a room with a textbook. Your two options are sitting there and being bored, or studying. And it's very simple. Lock yourself in that room with the textbook and don't force yourself to study. You don't have to study if you don't want to. Just the other option is to sit there and be bored. And I think boredom is a very powerful emotion. As you become more and more bored, you'll be more and more motivated to study and stimulate your mind. So that's an example of utilizing an emotion to make forward progress in your studying, instead of just coping. For example, instead, when you feel bored, you could just play video games. And yeah, that takes care of the boredom, but it doesn't push you in any forward direction in your life. The same thing with stress. Let's say you're really stressed, you're about to fail a class. That can push you to do the best you can, to salvage your grade, to do better in the future. Or you can cope, and you can cope in an unhealthy way, you can cope in a healthy way. And if you cope in an unhealthy way, obviously you're just digging yourself deeper and deeper into a dark hole. For example, every time you feel stressed that you're about to fail a class, if you start playing video games, you're not making any forward progress, you're not learning, you're not going to do better next time, unless you stop playing the video game. But you could have used that emotion to push you to do even better than if you were coping unhealthy. But I realize that sometimes you have to cope, I think sometimes you have to cope. I think sometimes just sitting with the emotion and trying to keep pushing forward and trying to use that to push you forward, sometimes it's too difficult. Sometimes sitting with the emotion is absolutely overwhelming. So it's like a decision framework, right? We have sit with the emotion is like the top choice. But let's say you can't do that. Then you have two more options. You have cope in a healthy manner and an unhealthy manner. And I think it's relatively self-explanatory. I think you should then, if you can't sit with that emotion, and in your experience, when you've tried to sit with these emotions, with certain emotions, let's say you've tried to sit with them in the past, but they've just become too overwhelming, and you've ended up resorting to unhealthy coping mechanisms, then I think the most logical, the most rational thing to do is to say, all right, I am not good enough at sitting with my emotions to sit with this. I am not strong enough to do that. That is the humble thing to do. It would be arrogant to say, if in your past experience, every time you tried to sit with your emotions, you ended up resorting to unhealthy coping mechanisms, and you didn't make any forward progress in your life anyways, and you only dug yourself deeper into a hole, and you only behaved in an unhealthy manner, which is less beneficial than healthy coping, then it would be arrogant to think that after doing that time and time again, that you can somehow still sit with your emotions this time. So, like, logically speaking, be careful though. Ego is a trap. For example, let's say you're in a class, right? Let's say you're in a class. Let's say you're in high school, right? Freshman year, you want to get A's, right? Your parents are pushing you to get A's. Let's say you get all C's. And next year, like, fuck, I gotta do better this year. I gotta grind really hard, and I'm gonna get all A's. That's a compensatory goal, like a compensatory goal, yes. You're trying to compensate about how badly you did last year by setting an even harder, like, pushing yourself even harder this year to do even better. But rationally speaking, that doesn't make any sense. If you couldn't achieve A's last semester, unless you've made some drastic change, you've had some drastic discovery, chances are you won't be able to go from C's to an A this semester. And you don't want to set goals that are unrealistic or too hard to reach. You don't want to set these compensatory goals, because once you start dropping down to a B, what are you going to do? You're going to feel so shit about yourself. You're going to feel so bad about yourself, and you're going to go back to unhealthy coping mechanisms. You're going to give up. You're going to have less motivation. Whereas if you set an achievable goal, such as, all right, I got C's last time, a reasonable goal is to get B's this semester, or even to get C pluses this semester, right? That's a more reasonable goal. And you're more likely to achieve that. And when you do achieve that, you can be proud of yourself. You can say, all right, I achieved my goal. I can improve. And that can give you even more motivation, because humans are creatures that live off reinforcement, right? If you reinforce a behavior, for example, every time someone comes to your house, you give them like some cocaine, they're going to start coming back to your house because you're reinforcing that behavior. You're giving them a reward for doing a certain action. So let's say your goal is to get all A's in the next semester, and you're not going to get any reward, and you're only going to be less likely to try. You're only going to feel like trying is pointless because you can't achieve these super high standards that you're setting for yourself. But if you set standards such as, I'm trying to get all B's this semester, then you're more likely to achieve that, and then you will receive reinforcement, because you'll be like, all right, I did a good job, I reached my goal, and now next year my goal is to get all A's. And I'm not saying, the next semester, if it's possible, yes, you should try to get A's, but you shouldn't set your goal that high. You shouldn't set your standards that high, because standards are something you should use to reinforce good behavior, and good behavior is improvement. And it's arrogant to think that you can improve too much. Like, you have to look at your past experiences, and you got to set reasonable goals. That was basically the point of that whole tangent. And I do not remember what I was saying before this. Goals, addiction, healthy coping, unhealthy coping. All right, yeah. So what I was trying to say is, so the same concept of ego applies in the situation of healthy versus unhealthy coping versus sitting with your emotions. Let's say you keep trying to sit with your emotions. You keep trying to push through them. You keep trying to sit with them, push through them, and just like improve your life. And you don't cope at all because you don't believe in coping. The best way to improve your life is to push forward, right? I thought I heard something. But you've tried that. If you've tried that multiple times and you haven't succeeded, and you've just ended up going to unhealthy coping anyways, then the smarter thing to do next time is, when you feel these overwhelming emotions that in the past you haven't been able to handle, is to figure out some healthy coping mechanisms, which are at least better than unhealthy coping mechanisms, such as alcohol, and to go with those. So here's an example. Let's just say, let me think. Let's say you get bullied at school, right? So every day you go to school, you're getting bullied, right? Of course, this is a pretty drastic example. I think you should do something to change that. You should try your best, talk to an adult, talk to an authority figure in your school and try to change that. Okay, I'll give you an example where you can't change the situation, you can only handle it. Let's say your parents are dicks to you, right? Let's say your parents call you a loser. Let's say your parents are just really mean to you, and yeah, let's just say your parents are really mean to you. I would consider that to be like verbal abuse, but let's just say you're in a place where despite the verbal abuse, there's nothing you can do about it. You like CPS isn't going to take you out of the home because your parents are verbally abusing you. Chances are. Or let's just say the place you live in, there is no CPS, okay? You're stuck with your parents. Your two options are to live on the streets or to live with your parents. And every time your parents call you a loser, or they make fun of you, or they tell you to do better, that probably hurts you. That probably sucks. That probably, your parents, I would imagine, that would feel like your parents saying that you're not good enough. And that would feel bad. And let's say every time that happens, you go to your room and you play video games to feel better about yourself. Like, or let's say this, yeah, you go to your room and you play video games to feel better about yourself. Then you think, maybe I should sit with these emotions. Maybe they'll push me to do better. So next you try to sit with those emotions, but they just become so overwhelming that you end up playing video games anyways. And you try again to sit with those emotions, and you end up playing video games anyways. Then maybe you're setting too high of a goal for yourself. Maybe you should move up the levels. You should move up from unhealthy coping to healthy coping. So instead of playing video games, go outside and go for a run. And every time they talk shit about you, go outside and go for a run. Because at least then you're getting some exercise. So at least something good is coming out of it. So basically the moral of the story is don't be too arrogant, set reasonable goals, and try to improve in whatever way you can. Of course, don't focus on what you can't control. Such as if you're living with toxic parents, you can't control that. Unless you want to go live on the streets. But in most cases, unless your parents are really abusive, living with toxic parents is better than living on the streets. So let's say you can't change that situation. So accept the fact that your parents are going to be toxic, and you can do things to try to change it, and you should try. But there are many situations in life that you can't change. For example, I don't know. For example, let's just say you break your legs, right? Don't focus on I don't know, building leg muscle, because you can't do that. And don't just like wallow in your misery about it. Work on your arms if building muscle is your goal. Or yeah, work around it is basically what I was trying to say. And don't be arrogant, and be reasonable in your goal setting. Alright, I think that's enough for today's video. Thank you for watching.